Tom, thanks for that very generous, overly generous introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here for this part of this very worthy project. Tom, Andrew and your team, I want to thank you for coming up with this periodisation, because it really did challenge me. It forced me to think again about the Howard government's foreign policy, so I'd like to really thank you for that. What I'd like to argue today, ladies and gentlemen, is that 1997 to 2001 is a crucial era in defining the Howard government's foreign policy approach. Although most retrospectives would treat 2001 to 2007 as the coalition government's years of activism in foreign policy, I would argue that the early era was the crucible in which the Howard foreign policy approach achieved its definition. In foreign policy terms, the Howard government began 1997 somewhat battered and demoralised. The claims of its critics in the establishment and opposition that a Howard government would lack the capacity to credibly manage Australia's foreign relations seemed to have been borne out by a rather ordinary first year in foreign policy terms. But by 2001, the coalition government had well and truly found its mojo. By the end of the decade, it had successfully navigated the most serious crisis in Australian foreign policy since confrontation, picking up international plaudits and domestic applause from across the political spectrum. The poise that calmly and confidently handled the roiling events kicked off by Tampa and 9/11, the invasion of Iraq and beyond, had been forged arguably in the years 1997 to 2001. John Howard looks back in retrospect and defines his government's foreign policy around three principles. He told me in an interview back this July that these were, firstly, Asia first, but not Asia only. Secondly, we don't have to choose between our history and our geography. And thirdly, that bilateral relations are more fundamental to foreign policy than multilateral institutions. The principles that came to define the Howard government's approach to foreign policy were a combination of ideological and philosophical predispositions. But in my view, they can only explain part of the coalition's statecraft in the region between 1997 and 2007. A crucial part of the story is not about ideas, but about attitude. The confidence, tactical agility, and activism that were forged in the fires of the key events between 1997 and 2001. In other words, this period of Howard government foreign policy demonstrates that foreign policy equals predispositions interrogated by events. My contention is that had the foreign policy challenges of 1997 to 2001 found the coalition's instincts for managing them wanting, the government wouldn't necessarily have jettisoned its foreign policy principles. I believe there's a doggedness about Howard's political career that suggests it's unlikely the coalition would have rejected its animating beliefs. But without the influence of the events that tested, evoked and ultimately rewarded the Howard government's core foreign policy beliefs, we'd have had, after 2001, a Howard government remarkably less confident, less assertive, less inclined to take risks, to capitalise on sudden opportunities, and possibly more divided than we got as a result of the events of 1997 to 2001. The first events that shaped the coalition's foreign policy between 1997 and 2001 occurred before that period, as Howard and Alexander Downer sought to address what might be seen as foreign policy legacy issues. Most obviously, there was the Keating-Evans legacy. The Labor government had powerfully defined itself according to a grand, cosmopolitan, internationalist foreign policy agenda. So dominant was Labor's foreign policy narrative and so aligned with the New World Order euphoria that followed the end of the Cold War, that for most of the commentariat it was the only conceivable way of conducting Australian foreign policy. While there was much in Labor's foreign policy vision and approach that the coalition agreed with, particularly around issues of free trade, there were two implications that made Howard and Downer viscerally wary of the Labor foreign policy legacy. First, there was the national transformation agenda that had become attached to it. Beginning with the Garneau report back in 1989, there had been a rising tide of elite opinion in Australia that, in order to take advantage of a booming Asia, Australia needed to become, quote unquote, enmeshed with the region. Now, what enmeshment really meant was not really defined, but there was apparently a normative as well as an institutional element. That part of being enmeshed involved being accepted into Asia. And to be properly accepted, Australia needed to transform itself. It began with being more Asia literate and economically competitive, but it evolved into identity issues: the Republic, the flag, reconciliation. The second issue was the political agenda that had become attached to the Labor foreign policy approach. In the heat of the election campaign in 1996, Labor had decided to characterise John Howard as uncomfortable with Asians. Keating claimed that Asian leaders wouldn't deal with Howard, implying that Australia's international economic future was at risk with a change of government. Both charges hit a nerve in John Howard. He refused to accept that Australia had to change to succeed with Asian countries, and the implication that there was somehow something wrong with the way Australia was. He was also acutely aware that the Keating charge that Asians wouldn't deal with him had the media primed to watch him fail. As he embarked on his first trip to Asia, John Howard recalls that laying the Keating jibe to rest was, quote, very much on his mind, unquote. The second legacy issue was 1996. Tom, I'm going to have to disagree with you here. The Howard government's first year was, in my opinion, largely a write-off in foreign policy terms. A series of largely serendipitous events, some alliance-related, some involving visits to Taiwan and visits of the Dalai Lama here, coincided with a particularly sensitive Chinese government to pitch Sino-Australian relations into the deepest crisis since diplomatic normalisation. The Howard government became an early target of a now familiar piece of Chinese statecraft, placing all relations into indefinite deep freeze in response to a country's incurring of the Chinese Communist Party's displeasure. If Howard had any doubts about the political potency of this foreign policy crisis, they evaporated as his foreign minister came under sustained attack in Parliament for allegedly misleading Parliament about the cancellation of a tide aid scheme. It was a situation that seemed to play into the Keating taunt, corroding the coalition's carefully crafted image of hard-headed, competent management of the nation's interests. But the tide turned towards the end of 1996 at an APEC summit in the Philippines, where Howard had a meeting that he rates as among the most important of his career with Chinese President Jiang Zemin. A nervous Howard suggested to the Chinese president that the two countries acknowledge their differences while concentrating on their substantial complementary interests. This formula, shared interests and mutual respect, came to be a central tenet in the coalition's approach to the region. Crucially, it was a formula that spoke to China's interests. of being allowed to participate in the global economy without being subject to hectoring lectures about or attempts to change its own political system. But the formula crucially also chimed with John Howard's deepest foreign policy instincts. He was viscerally opposed to the notion that Australia had to change itself in order to relate to Asia. After 1997, the coalition government became increasingly confident in asserting that Asia itself was highly internally diverse, that Australia couldn't and wouldn't suddenly change itself on a foreign policy whim, and that difference was no obstacle to relating to a highly differentiated set of countries. John Howard also believed that Australia had a great deal to offer in the region. He told me earlier this year, quote, "It always seemed to me when travelling around Asia that we had the best of all worlds. We represented the Western liberal tradition and all that came with that, and we had a close associations with the US, Britain and Europe, but we didn't have the burden of being the biggest operator on the block or having been a former colonial power. And that seemed to give us an acceptability and an entree," unquote. Mutual respect and shared interests became a mantra of the Howard government, helping build the comfort levels of regional leaders with the Australian government and laying the foundations of stable and productive relationships in the region. But mutual respect didn't imply timidity. In early 1997, the Papua New Guinea government, frustrated at its inability to end the Bougainville conflict and Australia's lack of assistance to it in doing so, hired a mercenary group to help it end the conflict. When the commander of the Papua New Guinea Defence Force intervened to seize the mercenaries and rioting gripped Port Moresby, the Australian government rightly feared its closest neighbour would slide towards African-style chaos. The coalition's response prefigured its later activism in securing Australia's interests in the near region. Intelligence assets, development aid and diplomatic isolation were mobilised to pressure the Papua New Guinean government to expel the mercenaries. The 3rd Brigade of the ADF in Townsville was readied for intervention if necessary. The message was very clear. The coalition was prepared to mobilise whichever elements of its formidable intelligence, security and military resources it felt necessary to secure Australia's interests in its near region. Australia's decade of interventions had begun. 1997 also saw the coalition deliver the first ever white paper on foreign and trade policy. It was a careful document, thoughtfully weaving in substantial elements of continuity with traditional orthodox Australian foreign policy approaches, while abruptly announcing certain important departures from foreign policy orthodoxy. Most significant of these departures was the decidedly sceptical tone on multilateralism, both in its global and its regional variants. The coalition's emphasis on bilateralism reflected a bottom-up approach to global order, a suspicion of grand schemes for transforming and holding a complicated world to account, and a belief that foreign policy had to deliver demonstrable, evident benefits for the Australian population. The Howard government was, in effect, setting itself a series of KPIs, inviting supporters and detractors to watch its progress in managing and improving Australia's bilateral relations with regional countries. Now, just as the white paper was going to press, the Asian financial crisis threw the region into chaos. The coalition's newly printed foreign policy blueprint provided almost no guidance on what to do in the face of the largest cataclysm to hit the region since the end of the Vietnam War. As a result, the crisis and its political aftermath tested the Howard government to its core, throwing it back on its political and philosophical instincts and honing a confidence in its ability to spot and capitalise on unexpected opportunities. Howard, Downer and Peter Costello sensed early on that here was an opportunity to demonstrate the coalition's credentials in Asia, perhaps decisively puncturing Keating's jibe. The coalition sensed that both substance and symbolism mattered in the way that Australia responded to the Asian financial crisis. Neither the United States nor the IMF understood that the crisis was more than a correction for the countries of Asia. For the countries of Asia, it was an existential challenge to their very sense of success and worth and being. Australia did. As Downer said later, quote, "It was a crucial time for us, a time for Australia to put up or shut up on the question of its commitment to Asia. It became, if you will, a defining moment for Australia's relationship with Asia and allowed us to prove, as perhaps no other event could have, that the ties we had built were deep and lasting," unquote. The government ensured that it offered $1 billion in assistance to the three most affected economies. Alexander Downer flew especially to Washington to lobby the United States government and the IMF to ease the conditions of Indonesia's bailout. These were gestures that registered deeply in the region. Alexander Downer and Ambassador Andrew Peacock in Washington were also able to exploit the crisis in the opposite direction, using it effectively to convince the Americans that Australia had genuine fingertips expertise in Asia that could inform US foreign policy. Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush would thereafter turn to Australia on several occasions for advice on how to handle developments in Asia. The Asian financial crisis gave the coalition a sense of Australia's distinctive strength and value to the Asian region. It was a confidence that Downer would ride in his campaign to join what eventually became the East Asia Summit. The fall of Suharto in 1998 showed the coalition government confident in giving rein to the full measure of its tactical opportunism in foreign policy. The president that replaced Suharto, B.J. Habibie, was much more ambivalent about East Timor as integral to Indonesia than most of the Indonesian elite. The Howard government saw and seized the opportunity to propose a process for shepherding East Timor to a more autonomous role within Indonesia. It was taken by surprise by Habibie's impulsive opting for a referendum on independence and had to madly improvise as a full-blown crisis unfolded. Once again, the opportunity to show commitment, principle and capability to the region and to the United States presented itself. And the Howard government importantly prioritised this over maintaining cordial bilateral relations with its largest neighbour. Howard signalled to the United Nations Secretary-General that Australia was in a position to offer the major part of an intervention force after Indonesian-backed militias went berserk after the independence vote. But he insisted that Australia would lead it. The contrast between what Australia was able to do, assembling a broad coalition of regional and non-regional contributors to Interfet, and what other regional countries and organisations were not, was stark. It did lead to a bit of hubris from Howard and Downer. Remember Fred Brenchley's famous piece in the Bulletin magazine of the Howard Doctrine and the Deputy Sheriff label that came out of that I believe were themselves part of the maturation of the Howard foreign policy team. East Timor had other effects also on how foreign policy and national security policy is made to this day in Australia. For the first time, Australia had to lead a coalition rather than just contribute to one. It was a challenge that placed huge strain on the national security apparatus, in the process changing that apparatus into a more presidential system of advice and coordination centred much more on the Prime Minister's office. Finally, I must mention the Howard government's new management of the US alliance. 1998 saw twin events that redefined for both sides what the alliance would grow to in the decade ahead. Operation Desert Fox in Iraq and East Timor itself. In the former, the coalition was quick to commit Australian Special Forces to a possible enforcement operation against Saddam Hussein. In the latter, it reacted with disappointment and anger at the Clinton administration's unwillingness to commit American forces to interfere. It signalled a government in Canberra with ambitions for the alliance had succeeded a government that had ambitions within the alliance. My point has been, ladies and gentlemen, that while the Howard government brought to office most of its philosophical principles in foreign policy, it was the key events of 1997 to 2001 that gave it a crucial and often ignored component of successful statecraft: confidence. This was the crucial quality that defined the activist half-decade that followed 2001. The willingness to tolerate bad relations with Indonesia over asylum seekers and the Iraq War. The deft response to the Boxing Day tsunami to restore those relations. The dogged pursuit of regional acceptance despite blunt assertions of Australian values, and of course, the activism within the alliance. Thank you.
Just get Michael to return because he still gets the final word. Please, your questions, if you just raise your hand, wait for the microphone to come. Tell us who you are and we look forward to hearing from you.
Stunned to silence.
Let me ask while people are thinking of their question. One of the criticisms of the Howard government was it put President Habibie in a position where, if you like, East Timor was brought on at a time that wasn't perhaps the best in terms of manageable outcomes of both Indonesia and Australia. How do you respond to that criticism of the government?
Look, I think it's a criticism of hindsight. I really do wonder, it's one of those really interesting counterfactual situations that the Howard government was faced with the sudden ability to remove an irritant from the bilateral relationship. I think there was a real sense that here was an opportunity to be seized, and perhaps an incomplete understanding of how Habibie would respond. My feeling was that John Howard and his team of advisors probably took a calculated gamble, and I guess betting on the overreaction of Habibie would not have been a reason not to try that gamble, not to try and do something about it. In the end, it was a catalyst that really did, I think the government did sense that it had lost control of what was happening and had to respond pretty quickly to it. But in the end, it was one of those calculated gambles of history.
And having the same minister for 11 years, is that always good?
Well, if you look at it, Australia has had remarkably long-serving foreign ministers in relation to its defence ministers. At one stage you were able to look back, I think probably at the end of the Rudd government and look back on 25 years of governments in Australia and count, I think, either 4 or 5 foreign ministers. So I think by the end of it, people like Gareth Evans and Alexander Downer brought a great deal of experience and simply the sort of personal relationships to their jobs. And I think it allowed both of them to do a remarkable amount in their jobs. They probably became real nightmares for their departments because often, and I briefly served as an official towards the end of it, there was a sense that Alexander sort of felt that he knew more about what you were briefing him on than you did, which often was a bit of a challenge. But I think in general the benefits were manifest. That it was, I think both the Keating-Evans period and the Howard-Downer period gave regional countries a real sense that they knew who they were dealing with. There was a real sense of a face and an approach and a predictability about the personalities involved.
Are there any questions from the audience? Question, just please wait for the microphone.
Troy Reeves. Found your presentation very interesting. It sort of brought back very vividly my university days. Notwithstanding being a young Liberal at the time, I was still quite worried about the Asian economic crisis and what that would do for our post-university job prospects. But thank you to Mr. Howard that it didn't. It also reminded me how pervasive this attitude was that we had to have Asian values. It was 97 when I was my first year in uni. And I remember a university lecturer who seemed not to have noticed there'd been an election that the year before was still carrying on with we must have Asian values. And I stood up rather nervously in a group of 300 students and said, in China they roll over their people with tanks. In Indonesia, there's a group of people having to fight for their freedom. In Malaysia, they've just thrown in jail their deputy prime minister on trumped-up sodomy charges for speaking out. Which Asian values are superior to Westminster democracy? And of course I was booed, but a lot of those people in that room subsequently joined the Liberal Club too. So it's just very interesting to bring back that period.
No, thanks for that comment. I mean, I think history will probably show that the Asian financial crisis put paid to the Asian values debate, if you like, within Asia itself, or the Asian values movement, and certainly here in Australia, possibly in the longer version of the paper. 5,000 words is a very short amount of very small number of words to write about all of this, Tom, by the way. If you go back through the Howard governments, particularly John Howard's and Alexander Downer's speeches over that time, there were some really interesting speeches that they made, because you'll remember, as you said, early on in the Asian financial crisis, there were real fears of contagion, that what had happened to the Asian economies would affect our economy. And then it appeared that the Australian economy wasn't just maintaining its resilience, it was actually booming during this period. I think Warwick McKibben said it was a displacement effect. A lot of the investment that was flowing out of Asia was flowing into Australia. But it was really interesting that Mr. Howard and his ministers actually started to say in public, this actually demonstrates the benefits of being different. And I remember there was a prominent cartoon in which there was a kind of a hunter that's on the back of an elephant, which said global markets wandering around shooting Asian tigers, and there was a kangaroo sort of with a sign in front of it saying, "Not an Asian tiger, we are not Asian." So, it was, I think, a really profound, I think we'll look back on the Asian financial crisis as a really profound shift in the way that Australia kind of saw itself in relation to Asia. And I think it was a big part of the Howard government, gaining that confidence and gaining that mojo in, as John Howard often used to say, being itself in the region.
So you didn't agree with my assessment of 96, and that's kind of fine, but what was it that went from the beginning of that period where you think that it was clunky, there were mistakes? Was it just a lack of experience? Was it not having the right advisors in place? What do you think accounted for that?
Oh, look, I think there was a little bit of inexperience, certainly in the DIF matter. I think you go back and you look at it. I haven't had a chance to talk to Alexander Downer about it, but I think there were probably some problems in communication within that office that happened. But I think a lot of the events were just serendipitous. There was a Taiwan election coming. The United States, of course, was going to intervene, and it's a good question. Would the Labor government have, if it had been re-elected, have been as clear in its support of the US? Maybe not. But I think the Howard government did come to power determined to do something with the American alliance and, as it said, reinvigorate the American alliance. So I think a lot of it was serendipitous, and it occurred at a time when China was feeling, and I see Rick Smith's here, and Rick might have a view on this, was feeling very sensitive about itself. It had just been through a rough period with the Clinton administration, and it saw a new government in Australia. It had just seen, I think, the Hashimoto government in Japan seek to tighten relations with the United States, and was feeling very, very sensitive about things. And I think I'm right to say that post Tiananmen Square, Australia copped it, was the first country to cop that sort of diplomatic deep freeze that Canada and Norway and Germany and various other countries copped in the 2000s. So we were a bit of a guinea pig. And I think, you know, it was enough to unsettle any government when you're facing that from the Chinese. And if you look back at the record, the barrage was pretty constant. The Chinese, you know, were scrupulous to embarrass Alexander Downer over DIF as well, when, you know, they were scrupulous to say, you know, that they had provided a briefing to Downer saying that they were disturbed by the cancellation of DIF. So, yeah.
Please join with me in thanking Mike.